Okay, I'm going to start with part B of session 14. In this part, I'm going to talk about what's called the Coase Theorem. Okay, Coase is named after Ronald Coase, a person who was actually some history kind of related to George Mason. It turns out that he's part of what some people call the Virginia School of Economics. And this Virginia school, it was all a group of people that were all working at UVA, sometime around like early 60s, maybe late 50s. One of the leaders of this school was James Buchanan, who won a Nobel Prize. James Buchanan is the person that Buchanan Hall is named after. That's where the main offices in the economics department are at. Um, so Buchanan worked with someone named Tulloch, and then probably a third person that was sometimes associated with the Virginia schools is a guy, Ronald Coase, who was also at UVA when Buchanan was there. Now, Buchanan and Tulloch, they eventually left for Virginia Tech. Then they left Virginia Tech for George Mason. So what's often called the Virginia School moved to George Mason, but for a time it was at UVA. And this person, Ronald Coase, was considered part of it. Ronald Coase, by the way, won a Nobel Prize. I can't remember. It was after Buchanan, I'm pretty sure. Anyway, he won a Nobel Prize largely for this theorem. So I'll explain it formally in a second or a few minutes, but let me give an example of how it's illustrated first. By the way, the book explains the concept of the Coase theorem, but it actually doesn't use those words. I'm actually a little surprised that the authors don't use that word, don't mention that Coase, Ronald Coase, is responsible. You should know that for the exam. There's a good chance I may say something. There's a good chance I'm probably going to do is just state the theorem and say, what is this? And one of the multiple choice answers will be Coase theorem. And by the way, earlier, one of the first lectures I gave, I think it's in session 1, where I showed my 4 great ideas of economics, and I think I put it third, maybe second and third, law of comparative advantage and Coase theorem, I think, are 2 of the great economic concepts of all time. So here we are. So we're going to learn one of the top 3 economic concepts of all time. So here's how it works. Here's an example. Okay. First, there are 2 people, Jess and Ina. Okay. And first, Jess has 2 choices. Can play. By the way, and they're both in a dorm, and they're both right next door to each other, and there's no one else around in the dorm to keep things simple. Okay. So it's Jess can play his music loud or play his music soft. Okay. There's a volume button, and it's either loud or soft. There's either or. Turns out the Coase theorem also works where there's a continuum, but let's keep things simple. It's either loud or soft. Okay. If he plays it loud, his benefit. Playing it loud, I'm going to say it's $25. If he plays it soft, it's 0. That's kind of his baseline amount of benefit. It's playing it soft, okay? But if he gets to play it loud, that's like $25 worth to him. Okay, meanwhile, Ina. She either experiences a noisy dorm room or a quiet dorm room. And the cost to her, okay, if she gets a quiet dorm room, the costs are 0. That's like the baseline to her. But if it's noisy, the cost to her is $15. So here we have a case of Jess playing music is a negative externality. This imposes cost on someone else, his next door neighbor, Ina. Okay. But now, one thing about just because there's a negative externality does not necessarily mean you want to outlaw it. Okay. And here's a case where you'd not want to do that because the benefit, Jess's benefit of playing loud music is actually greater than the costs that Ina experiences from having to bear to listen to that noise. Okay, so when I was a college student, we called it the resident fellow. That's kind of the person who was in charge of the dorm. Then that person had a few resident assistants to help him or her out. So the resident fellow, let's say, can make a rule whether Jess can play the music loud or soft. And in this case, efficiency would say, look, it's fine. Let Jess play it loud. Okay. In a second, I'm going to talk about what if we change that number from 15 to something like 30. Then the rule would change. Then all of a sudden the efficiency would say, no, in that case you shouldn't play it loud. Okay, but for now it's only 15. So the efficiency would say, let Jess play his music loud. Okay. Now, your first thought would be, if we want to get to efficiency, the key is that resident fellow has got to make that the rule. The rule is that Jess can play his music loud if he wants to. Okay. But let's consider two possible rules. And in this Coase theorem, they often call these rules property rights. So you have the right to something. So there's two possible rights. Okay. One is we could have Ina owns the right to a quiet dorm room. Okay. So if she owns that right, we'd probably say, okay, she has that right, then Jess cannot play the music loud. Okay. An alternative right that the resident fellow could give, you could say, no, Ina does not have that right. Instead, Jess has the right to play music loud. Okay. Okay. So, okay. Question is, okay, which right should we adopt? Okay. Let's see. I'm running out of room on this whiteboard. Here's what we want to do. So first, let's consider if it's case one. Case one, what would happen? Okay, Ina owns the right to a quiet dorm room. You'd think, okay, when that happens, then Jess cannot play his music loud. Okay, and if he did, Ina would go to the resident fellow. Hey, look, Jess is playing it loud. Okay, the resident fellow says, you can't do that, Jess. Okay, but what actually might happen, and this was the genius of Coase, is if Ina owned that right, Jess might make a bargain, might make a deal with Ina and say, look, Ina, I'm going to pay you. If this is a benefit of $25, I'm willing to pay up to $25 to have the right to play music loud. So in a sense, I'm buying that right from you. Your right to have a quiet dorm room, I'm buying that so you don't have that anymore. And I'm willing to pay up to 25. Ina would say, yeah, I'm willing to make that deal as long as he's willing to pay above 15. So if they made an arrangement, say they came to an agreement at $20, okay, Jess says, hey, I'll pay you, Ina, $20. Ina would say yes, okay? So the result we should expect in this case So Ina owns the right to a quiet dorm room. We should expect Jess to buy that right for a price between 1501 for a price 1501 to 24.99. Okay, there should be a price they can agree to somewhere in that range where Jess would make that transfer, would pay that money to Ina. Okay, and as a result, Jess plays music loud. Okay, so if that's the property right, if it's one, we should get the end result is that the property right is transferred and Jess ends up playing loud music. We still get efficiency. Okay, we said efficiency would be where Jess plays his music loud in this case. On the other hand, what if the resident fellow gave property right two? He said, instead of Ina having the right to a quiet dorm room, Jess has the right to play his music loud. Okay. In this case, if we have uh, case two, so Ina might complain, but she's not willing to buy that right from Jess. Okay? And here's why. Because Jess should say the Jess has the right to play his loud music, so he's playing loud music. Ina says that's a cost to me. How much is the cost? $15. How much am I willing to pay for that? Well, I'm not willing to pay 16. I would rather just bear the burden of the music than have to pay $16. So the only way I would buy that right, if I'm Ina, is if I can do it at a price less than $15. But meanwhile, Jess is saying, how much am I willing to sell this right? Well, I get a benefit from $25. You're going to have to pay me more than $25 to get me to sell that right. So Jess is not willing to sell for anything below $25. So there's no deal they can get. So you say, what's the price got to be? Jess says, well, it's got to be more than 25. Ina says, well, it's got to be less than 15. There's no way they can make a deal. There's no number that satisfies both those constraints. So what happens is the result is Jess plays music loud, and there's no transaction. Okay. Now I want you to notice something. Look, notice that either way, if the dorm resident fellow assigned property rights to Ina, that is case one, or if he assigned the property rights to Jess in case two, either way, we get the same result in terms of whether music is playing loud. Both cases, we get Jess plays music loud. Okay? And we said that before, we said that was the efficient outcome, or Jess plays loud. So either way, no matter how the dorm resident fellow assigned rights, we got the same outcome. Okay? Okay, now I'm going to do this quickly, and unfortunately, I've got a small board. I'm not going to be able to do this as well. So I'm going to do the red marker. I'm going to change this. So instead, I'm going to make the cost 30. Okay. So now, before with black, efficiency was play music loud. Now with red, now efficiency is Ina gets a quiet dorm room. That is, Jess plays the music soft. Okay, that's what efficiency says. Okay. Let's see though, the same thing happens. Okay, no matter how the resident fellow assigns the rights, we're still going to get the efficient outcome. But now the efficient outcome is the quiet dorm room. Okay, now if it's case one, okay, case one in red, you now have the Ina's cost is $30. Ina owns the right to a quiet dorm room. Okay, Jess says, "Hey, Ina, you have the right to a quiet dorm room. Um, but look, this is worth $25 to me if I can play music loud. What if I pay you 24? I'm willing to pay 24, $24.99." Ina would now say, "No, that's not enough. You got to pay me more than $30." Okay. Result: Jess can't buy. Jess can't buy that right. There's no price that works. Okay, and then the opposite happens. Jess plays music soft. Okay, Ina gets a quiet dorm room. Okay, in this case, no transaction. Now, what happens with two? Now, the the resident fellow that said Jess has the right to play his music loud. Okay, we're in case two. Now, what would happen? I'm just gonna erase this. In this case, Jess has the right to play loud music. Ina would say, "Look, Jess, I'm willing to pay you to give up that right." So I'm willing to pay up to $30. Jess would say, "Well, I'm willing to pay to give that right away if you pay me at least 25." So as long as Ina pays something in between 25 and 30, they may have to haggle this out, but there will always exist a price that can make both of them better off. So now the result would be that Ina would buy that right, and she would get the quiet dorm room. So the same thing as before. Result: Jess plays music softly. Ina pays Jess something between 25.01 to 25.99. She makes some payment in between there, and Jess would be willing to give up his right. So the same thing happens. Notice that no matter how the resident fellow assigned rights, we end up with the same outcome. Jess plays music softly. Okay. So once again, the efficient outcome was Jess plays music softly. Ina gets a quiet dorm room. No matter how the property rights are assigned, we get the same result. Okay. We may get a different payment between them according to how the property rights are assigned, but we get the same result in terms of whether Jess plays music loudly or softly. Okay, so that is an example of the Coase Theorem. Let me write that now. Okay. Coase Theorem. Okay. If property rights are adequately defined, okay, so that means the precise, someone has said precisely what they mean. And also another key to this is that there's third party enforcement. Okay, so for that previous example, we had a resident fellow who was willing to say, here are the property rights, and I'm going to enforce it, possibly with force if I have to. Okay, so if property rights are adequately defined, then, okay, dash as long as transaction costs are low, are low, put low enough. I'll explain that more precisely in a second. Are low enough, and as long as efficiency will result. We'll get an efficient outcome. Okay. So, what does that mean? Okay, so you saw the example. As long as the dorm resident fellow just said, here's the way rights are assigned. Either Jess has the right to play music loud, or Ina has the right to a quiet dorm room. Didn't matter what he said, as long as he said one or the other, said it explicitly, defined it precisely, was willing to enforce it as a third party, then you get efficiency. Now, I put in another phrase in there, as long as transaction costs are low. Here would be an example of a transactions cost. So before, we needed Ina to be, so suppose Jess had the right to play his music loud. Ina had a cost of $30. So what if, now remember before we said that Ina has, it's a cost of $30 when that music is loud. She would have to pay at least 25 to Jess to get Jess to stop. Okay. Now, in a sense, she's making a profit somewhere between $0 and $5. She's getting rid of those $30 costs, but having to pay something at least 25, depending if she's a good bargainer and sets a price at 25, she gets a $5 profit. But if she's not a good bargainer, it's at $27.50, her profit's only $2.50. Okay, so the most, and this is what I'm calling profit, the most it could be is $5 for Ina. What if just the effort of having to walk to the dorm room of Jess to try to make a deal with him, suppose that is worth $7 worth of effort, of hassle, that Ina just says, do I want to do that? Walking over to see Jess, that is like an extra cost of $7. Then when that happens, she would say, the best I can get out of this is a profit of $5, and it's $7 worth of hassle. It's not going to be worth it to me. It's $7. It's just not worth trying to make this deal with Jess. So if that's the case, that the hassle of trying to make a deal, if that is high, we call that transactions costs, and in this case we would say they are not low enough. That in that case, the transactions costs are too high, where you might not get efficiency. Ina might just say it's not even worth trying to negotiate a deal. Okay, in that case, we would say the Coase theorem does not work. The transaction costs were too high. Okay, and so the book has a few examples of those. And often I think it wasn't quite clear when they talk about property rights are key, and um, sometimes they weren't very precise and very clear about exactly what that means. So I wanted you to see an example, see Coase Theorem explained in a very precise way. Um, for your tests, okay, there's a good chance I will write this exact statement, okay? If property rights are adequately defined, blah blah blah, and then the question I might say, what is the name of the statement? And A might be Coase theorem, B might be something else, C might be, so know how to recognize this Coase. Um, um, so the key is when we talk about a property right, okay, with the Coase theorem, uh, one key, as I said, is it's got to be third party enforcement. We've got to have a government or something like a resident fellow who's willing to enforce that. Another aspect of a property right is you have to be able to buy and sell it. Okay. There are some cases where the government will say you own something in a sense, but it will not let you buy and sell it. So, for instance, I own my body, I own my labor, but it turns out if I try to sell that as an indentured servant, the government will not recognize that transaction. Okay, so there's a case where you could call my body, my labor, a property. Actually, I can't sell it. The U.S. government will not enforce the buying and selling in that. So, in a sense, I don't have a property right to that. So, that's another key part of the Coase theorem that you have to be able to buy and sell it. Here's another example of this. This happens from a great economist. His name is Robert Tollison. Used to be at George Mason. Um, uh, Left to teach at Clemson University. Passed away about a couple years ago. Great man. Um, a very long time ago, I had a visiting position at George Mason. I was still a grad student, and I was talking to Robert Tollison, and we were talking about the problem with high school sports. And one problem is that the coach will often say, "Hey, you got to play with pain. If you're injured, you still got to play." And there's a problem with that, and it's because the coach doesn't have the right incentive. The coach wants the player to play and doesn't care about the long-term costs of that injury because the coach, won't have to suffer those once the player leaves the team. And Bob Tollison, he's got a kind of South Carolina accent. He just is no property rights. His point was, we don't have the Coase theorem. We're not getting efficiency in this case. And the reason is there is no property rights. There's no way for the coach to own that player. That's what he was saying. So there are some cases where the government is not enforcing a property right. And when I say is you can't buy and sell whatever that right is. Okay. And then a final point I want to talk about on the Coase theorem. Um, we talked earlier about what is the invisible hand. And this just says that often people just pursuing their own self interest that works toward the public good. And that was kind of the genius of Adam Smith. Now, most economists will tell you that, well, in the presence of externalities, though, the invisible hand might not work. You might not get the public good if you have externalities. Okay. I'd say that's largely true, but Coase would come back and say, hey, not so fast. Even if you do have externalities, as long as property rights are defined and people are allowed to make these transactions, they can buy and sell those property rights. You have third party enforcement and the transactions costs are low, then you still will get efficiency. You still will get an invisible hand like result. Everyone just pursuing their own selfish interests will still work toward the public good. Okay, so that's the final aspect of that. The Coase theorem kind of helps support the invisible hand. helps extend it, even sometimes to the cases where we do have externalities. Okay, so that is Coase theorem, and in there that's part B. See you in part C.